I'm delighted to welcome you this evening for an evening with Kat. I'm going to just briefly introduce Kat and then let Kat tell you more about herself and her journey. Kat Aldred is a Cree and Métis artisan, scholar, and auntie from Grande Prairie, Alberta, now living in Richmond, BC. Delighted to have her this evening. Kat has a master's in religious studies, First Nations Bible translation from McGill, and she enjoys capturing animals and their joie de vivre in art. And I think if you've had a look at the art, you really, really get that. I loved this little description. Kat says she describes her style as essentially Cree with a hint of irony and a dash of whimsy. Love that. Love that. So I'll turn it over to Kat. Welcome and thank you for being with us. Thank you.
And everybody hear me okay? I'm kind of quiet, so. So I prepared a little something to say today, just kind of about my story and how art became a part of that story and how it's brought a lot of healing into my life. So I call this series in Cree kahkiyaw, pisiskiwak, kâ-misikiticik, kâ-apisîsisicik. So it means basically all creatures, the big ones and the little ones. I'm just going to read a little thing that I prepared. From a young age, I loved animals of all shapes and sizes. Being a shy, reserved child, I considered them my friends. I had a special fondness for bugs. My mom tells me that when I was about 7 years old, I would bring ants home wrapped in paper in my pocket and ask her for an empty margarine container to build a home for them. None survived, but I often wondered to myself who would take care of the little things if I didn't. I attribute a lot of this love of nature to my Indigenous heritage. I was lucky enough to be raised in a home where I was encouraged to take pride in this part of my identity. Unfortunately, so many Indigenous children still didn't and still don't have that pride instilled in them at all. Self-deprecation is just one of the effects Indigenous people struggle with today due to the legacy of residential schools and other assimilationist tactics. But my father and mother worked hard to reclaim as much knowledge of our Cree and Métis heritage as possible. And they passed this on to me and my siblings. My dad became a pastor, and we ran a little Indigenous church in Regina for 14 years. And so I was proud of this part of myself. I was blissfully unaware of the darkness of racism and prejudice until about high school. For several years, my dad would bring the company teepee to my high school. Then my Indigenous studies class would sit inside and he would tell them stories. On those occasions, I would beam with pride. One year, after Dad had finished and we returned to class, one of my classmates asked me if my dad had a job, because her parent had told her that Indians are lazy and they live off the government. This is when I started to realize a different side of the Indigenous experience, and I had only begun to scratch the surface. I began to understand that while on the outside I was the same as my peers, my perspective and worldview as a First Nations person often isolated me from my non-Indigenous classmates. By the time I graduated high school, I had developed a poor self-esteem and often crippling social anxiety. However, I didn't let it stop me from pursuing post-secondary education. I started university in fine arts, but switched programs after only a year. At the time, I thought my art wasn't good enough, and I had nothing important to say. I couldn't have understood at that time that my art would be a God-given healing balm over the next 20 traumatic years of my life. From university, I moved to Bible college, where I found a new direction, languages. I fell in love with Greek and Hebrew. Though this was one of the best experiences of my life, it was in my final year of Bible college when I had my first mental breakdown, following a bad breakup. I suffered from insomnia and intense anxiety and spent my entire spring break at my parents' house in Calgary. During this time, everything on TV upset me. The only thing I could watch was BBC's Planet Earth series. There was something soothing about listening to David Attenborough and watching the purity and simplicity of animals in their habitats. I recovered significantly, and upon graduating Bible college, was offered a scholarship to Yale University to study Bible translation and First Nations languages. Around this time, I started learning Cree. My grandmother, who was Cree, had said she spoke Cree when she was young, but her father told her to stop speaking it because it would only cause her trouble. Beliefs like this have been the cause of the loss of First Nations languages across Canada. Though I managed to graduate with my master's degree, my struggle with mental illness often made it difficult to function in everyday life. I managed to get a job at the Bible Society in Toronto, working especially with First Nations languages. And in many ways, I was living the dream. I felt I might finally have a way to contribute to my Indigenous community and connect to my roots. Little did I know that this would be one of the most traumatic experiences of my life. Though I won't go into detail of what I witnessed in my time there, it was heartbreaking to experience institutional racism firsthand. After 2 years, my mental health at an all-time low, I left the Bible Society. For the next 10 years, I was in and out of psychiatric facilities. I was diagnosed as bipolar. I lacked purpose and struggled to reconcile my faith in the Creator with the institution of the Christian church. I wanted unconditional love and acceptance, but church no longer felt like a safe place to find that. So I stopped attending church altogether. I hadn't stopped believing in the Creator. I just wasn't sure anymore how to express my faith. It was an accident that I fell back into art, but that art would be the Creator's path for healing my heart. I had set aside drawing and painting for 10 years while I was in school. I found myself unemployed and struggling mentally, in large part due to COVID. It was then that I turned to art to help me cope. Up until then, the art I did was primarily realism and cartooning. I had never experimented with Cree Indigenous style before and decided to give it a try. Sloths were popular at that time, and I'd recently seen one in real life. I thought, what would a Cree-style sloth look like? My ancestors had no conception of exotic animals. Now, Indigenous artists have so much more to pull inspiration from. I wanted to think outside the box. And so this series of animal paintings began. Taking inspiration from Indigenous artists I was familiar with, I came up with my first painting of the sloth. I incorporated classic elements of Cree woodlands and Ojibwe art to create my own technique. This includes the thick black lines, bold colors, and the inner segmentation of the animal's body, with markings that give the viewer an almost X-ray view. Looking closely at the paintings, you may notice ribs, bones, or veins. As my style continues to evolve, I've painted many more animals. However, all my animal paintings have 3 orbs in them, representing the Creator in 3 parts, and lines representing the inner energy that the Creator uses to connect all things. I learned tonight as well, my dad was telling me that he's talked to people who go on vision quests, and they say words come and comfort them. I was like, wow, that really fits with kind of what I was picturing. So I also started to research the meanings of the different animals I was painting, and after many requests, I made my paintings into greeting cards with the painting and the meanings on the back of them to sell at markets. I called my business Posis Creative. Posis is my nickname. It just means cat in Cree. And I've signed my name as Cat with a paw since grade school. So I included the paw in there. You'll notice on the prints and cards that I still sign my name that way. It was the love of creation, my artwork, and divine intervention that brought me back to a place of peace, mental stability, and forgiveness. Not all at once, but one mark, one brushstroke, one painting at a time. And it was my indigenous identity that gave me the appreciation for the sacredness of all living things. In my culture, the appearance of animals in our lives has significant meaning. We respect the animals like we would our own relatives. They teach us lessons and guide us as we walk our paths. They show us how to live a joyful life. Expressing the joy and movement in the animals I paint encourages me to seek that same joie de vivre in my own life. Many years ago, I met an elder named Sam Halkett at a gathering of Cree language keepers. He was from Little Red River, Saskatchewan, and he spent parts of each year living off the land in a teepee at his camp in northern Saskatchewan. At some point, we were talking about how many young people struggle with mental health problems. He said something to me that has stuck with me all these years later. He said the reason young people were struggling so much is because they're afraid of nature. In other words, they've lost their connection to the land. As with any good elder teaching, it takes a few years to sink in. It would be another 10 before I turned back to the Creator and His creation for inspiration in my healing journey. And it has been incredibly therapeutic and joy-giving. I hope my art reflects a joyful spirit. As I continue on in my journey, I hope to promote awareness of Indigenous and mental health issues and to empower the younger generation of Indigenous creatives and thinkers to recognize their inherent value and the healing power of art. That's it from the talk. I'm open to taking a few questions if anyone has any.